Welcome back. Today I'm sharing true, disturbing stories from deep in the Irish countryside. These are tales of people who ventured into Ireland's remote bogs, abandoned villages, and ancient forests, and they found something they were never supposed to see. These stories prove some places should be left unexplored, so make sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button. Share this with your friends and let me know where you're watching from. I grew up on the edge of County Wicklow, where my grandparents' cottage sat in a small clearing that felt like the only open space for miles. You could stand on the stone step and feel the ancient oak forest pressing in from every direction. When I was young, I found that comforting. Like nothing could pass through those twisted trees unless my grandfather allowed it. He was the sort of man he always knew exactly what stirred on his land. If a twig snapped at the forest edge, he'd glance up from his tea and nod like he was expecting it. Back then, I believed nothing could surprise him. That sense of safety can vanish quicker than the mist off the Wicklow Mountains. After they passed, grandfather first, then grandmother, 2 winters later, no one was left to mind the place. The solicitor's letter finally forced me to face it last October. If I hadn't set foot near that cottage in 15 years, the narrow bareen became a little more than a sheep track. My small car scraping against the stone walls on either side. The silence was absolute. No lorries, no houses, not even telegraph poles. Just the whisper of wind through the gorse. By the time I reached the cottage, evening shadows stretched long across the overgrown garden. The thatch was black with rot, and one of the whitewashed walls had cracked so badly you could see daylight through their gaps. The heavy wooden door opened so easily it made my stomach lurch, like the cottage had been waiting. Inside, the familiar smell struck me. Turf smoke, wool, and something else. Something damp and sour like bog water. The old settee was still by the hearth. Grandmother's knitting needles were still stuck in a half-finished iron jumper. That first night, I went to bed early in the small room under the eaves. The cottage creaked and settled around me, every sound amplified in the mountain's quiet. I woke up sometime after midnight to a slow scraping beneath the floorboards, deliberate, measured, like fingers testing the wood grain. The scraping paused, then came a dull thud, like a fist pressing against the underside of the floor. I lay rigid, listening to my own heartbeat, thunder in my ears. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, scraping, pressing, searching. Come morning, I checked the crawl space. No disturbance, no tracks in the soft earth. I told myself it was settling timber, perhaps even a fox. The second night, I desperately tried to stay awake. The scraping started again after midnight, closer this time. Then I heard a voice, low, muffled, speaking Irish, in words I couldn't quite understand. Just wet, rasping syllables rising through the floorboards, like an old prayer spoken backwards. I ran. At the top of the narrow stairs, I stopped. The flagstones in the kitchen were lifting, one by one, as if something underneath was careful not to make a noise. I saw pale fingers emerge through the gap, then an arm, streaked with dark earth. I bolted from the cottage, across the garden, and into the forest. Pressed against an old oak trunk, I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. There's never any signal in the mountains. Behind me, the cottage door creaked open, and I heard footsteps moving through the garden, soft and deliberate. I pressed my face under the bark and held my breath. Eventually, the steps faded back towards the cottage. At dawn, I crept back, the door standing wide open, the flagstones neat and undisturbed. I gathered what I could carry and drove down the mountains until they faded away in my rear view. I was 26 when my cousin Seamus convinced me we should hike deep into the Connemara Hills, past where the tourists venture. We'd grown up in Galway, but somehow neither of us had explored those places where the bogs stretch into the horizon. Everyone knew the story about those hills. My grandfather used to sit by the fire, drinking whiskey and telling tales of travellers who'd followed the old cattle paths and never returned. They'd find their cars days later, but never a trace of the walkers themselves. Always said those bogs swallowed people whole, and the way his eyes fixed on the peat of the fire when he spoke made me think he knew more than he let on. Seamus never minded the old stories. He'd laugh them off, saying people made up fairy tales to keep outsiders from disturbing the peace. This time, he'd gotten it in his head to camp somewhere. The maps go white, as he put it. No mobile signal, no roads, just ancient bog and the satisfaction of true isolation. We parked beside a crumbling stone wall that marked the last of the improved land. The gate hung on one hinge, its iron black with rust. Beyond lay the bog, vast, treeless, stretching towards hills so distant they looked blue as storm clouds. The first few miles felt normal enough. We followed sheep tracks through the heather, past abandoned turf cuttings that had filled with dark water. The only sign of human passage were the stone circles, their purpose forgotten, and occasionally holy wells marked by faded ribbons. We made camp that first evening beside a small loch. Seamus built a fire from dried heather stems, while I boiled water for tea. As darkness settled over the bog, the silence grew profound. No cars or planes, just wind across the water and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. I lay awake long after Seamus started snoring, listening to footsteps that might have been curfews, landing in the rushes. Every sound seemed amplified in the thin mountain air. The second day, we got up and climbed towards the hills. The bog gave way to rocky ground, scattered with standing stones. Not the famous circles that tourists visit, but smaller markers, worn smooth by centuries of weather. Around midday, we found a stone carved with Ogham script, the ancient Irish alphabet, cut in deep lines up one edge. That afternoon, resting on a granite outcrop, I spotted movement in the valley below. At first I thought it was a red deer, pale and tall, picking its way between the stones. Then it straightened, revealing arms too, long, hanging, almost to the ground. Its head turned with unnatural patience, as if it was counting every rock, every blade of grass. When it tilted its face skyward, I saw the jaw separate and fall open. I couldn't breathe. The thing stepped behind the standing stone and vanished, leaving me staring at an empty bog. That night, we camped in a hollow ringed by ancient earthworks. We lit no fire. I didn't want anything to see where we were. I lay in my sleeping bag listened to curlew calls that gradually stopped, leaving only the whisper of one through the sage grass. Then a voice drifted across the bog. My mother's voice, speaking Irish in the soft Kerry accent of her childhood. My chest went hollow. I reached for Seamus, but his sleeping bag was empty. I scrambled from my tent, my torch beam wavered across the earthworks. Seamus! The bog swallowed my voice. My mother's voice called again, farther away now, mixed with other voices. Seamus, then my own voice, calling back to me from different directions. That's when I saw it, 20 yards away. Something pale, watched from behind a standing stone. Its skin gleamed wet in the torchlight, stretched too thin over bones that didn't fit. Long fingers brushed the ground. I ran, crashed through the heather, and over bog cotton, my torch beam jumping wildly. Behind me, voices rose in chorus, all speaking Irish, all calling my name in different tones, some sweet, some pleading, and some angry. Dawn found me collapsed beside the stone wall where we'd left the car. A Garda patrol picked me up hours later. We searched for Seamus for 3 days, but found nothing, not even tracks, beyond the place we camped. I grew up in a small town in County Cork that most people drive through without stopping. After university in Dublin, I told myself I was finished with that quiet life. But last autumn, my Uncle Paddy passed, and I found myself going back home for the funeral. Walking from the church, hands deep in my coat pockets, I felt something lodged under my ribs. Grief, mixed with something older, I'd carried since childhood, but that I'd never understood. That Sunday, I packed a rucksack with basics and drove to a trail I heard mentioned in the pub after a nice pint had loosened tongues. They call it Glen Scale, Shadow Valley. Back in the 1840s, a group of woodcutters had vanished there during the famine years. Some blamed the starvation, others said it was something that couldn't be explained in daylight. The trail began where the our road ended, marked by a weathered wooden sign, in Irish and English. Ancient woodland, enter at own risk. Rusted wire hung between the concrete posts. It was honestly more suggestion than a barrier. A mile in, I passed the remains of a famine cottage. 4 stone walls opened to sky, nettles growing thick inside. Just beyond it lay a clearing, circled by hawthorn trees. In the centre, a rowan sapling grew from a shallow depression in the earth, and something about seeing it made my mouth go dry. By evening, I'd reached the river, barely a stream now, trickling between moss-covered stones. I found a flat spot beneath ash trees, where the ground felt soft enough for my tent. When I bent to set down my pack, I saw them. Footprints in the soft earth beside the water. Small prints, too small for an adult, spaced far apart, as if whoever made them had been leaping from stone to stone. I built a small fire and tried to read, but kept glancing at the tree line. The light was fading when I heard the whistle, low, musical, drifting through the woods. 2 clear notes, then silence. Hello? My voice sounded thin in the gathering darkness. No answer. I let the fire die to embers and crawled into my tent, one hand resting on my father's old hunting knife. Sometime deep in the night, I awoke to the sound of careful footsteps circling my tent. Something pressed against the nylon near my leg. Just one finger, tracing the outline of my body through the fabric. I lay frozen until dawn, crept through the ash trees. When I finally unzipped the tent, there were no tracks, no sign anyone had been there. I broke camp quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed gear into my pack. At the trailhead, something was propped against my car, a piece of birch bark curled at the edges, with a shape carved into the pale surface. A crude figure with long limbs and no face. I grew up in a village called Glenfarra in the Donegal Gaeltacht. You probably never heard of it. It's scattered houses tucked into the vaults of the Derry Mountains, connected by narrow roads that twist between stone walls older than memory. The cottage I ended up staying in belonged to my great uncle Thomas. Everyone called it the place above Loch Dove, Black Lake, as if that explained everything. It was built from local stone, 2 stories, with walls thick enough to muffle any sound from the outside. Last December, after everything in my life went sideways, girlfriend left, job ended, mother calling daily to check if I was managing okay, I decided to spend the winter there, just until I sorted myself out. The first few weeks weren't bad. Days were quiet. I'd cut turf for the fire, repair loose stones in the walls, sit on the step with a tea that did slightly taste of bog water. But at night, the cottage reminded me that I was alone. The beams would crack in slow sequences that sounded like footsteps overhead. I kept the shotgun by the bed, not because I expected trouble, but because everyone in Glenfarra acted like it was common sense. Up here, you didn't assume you were safe just because you turned the key. That evening started like any other. I made a stirabout that tasted like warm paste, read an old book I'd found on the shelf, did my usual check of the doors and windows. I'd gotten into the habit of testing each bolt before bed. Around 10, I heard the first sound, a soft scraping across the flagstones outside, like something being dragged. Then 3 gentle taps on the door. I went to the window. The front step was empty, just my own footprints from earlier in the dried mud. I opened the door a crack. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of bog myrtle and something sour, like standing water. Nothing moved outside, so I closed the door and shot the bolt. Just before midnight came the knock. 3 measured raps. I stood so quickly, my book hit the floor. I pressed my palm to the door's cold wood. "Who's there?" Nothing. Not even the sound of feet on the flagstone. I returned to my chair with the shotgun across my knees, telling myself it was just the wind, just the cottage settling. Then I heard it. Footsteps overhead. Not the random creaks, but deliberate steps crossing the upstairs room. I climbed the narrow stairs, shotgun ready. The spare room door hung open. Empty bed, empty press, but the small window latched tight. I turned toward my own room, and I heard it, a whisper from behind the door, speaking rapid Irish, in a voice like wind through the rushes. I pressed my ear to the wood, heart hammering, taking a breath that felt too shallow. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. My unmade bed, my bags against the wall. Then something moved in my peripheral vision. A tall shape slipped along the wall, wrapped in what looked like a burial cloth. I raised the gun, finger finding the trigger, but the shape was gone. I turned and ran, down the stairs, out the door, and across the yard. My boots slipped on the whetstone, but I kept running until I reached the bend where the boring met the main road. I stayed there until sunrise, bent over and gasping. When I looked back, the cottage sat perfectly still against the mountainside. But I never went back. I was 24 when I got the idea to explore the old forestry roads behind my grandfather's place in Kerry. My uncle used to speak of those woods like they were cursed ground. He'd lean back in his chair, peel the label from his bottle of Murphy's, and say things like, "Those trees are older than any church you'll find in this county." Then he'd change the subject, as if he said too much. I always figured it was superstition, a way to keep children from wandering too far and getting lost in bog holes or tangled in abandoned barbed wire. I hadn't been back to that house in years, but when grandfather died, someone had to clear out what remained. The place looked like it was trying to sink back into the hillside. Brambles covered everything, the stone walls, the slate roof, even the old well in the garden. Inside smelled of thirst smoke, damp wool, and mouse droppings. I spent the day hauling out the boxes of belongings that seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. By evening, my shoulders ached like lead weights. That's when I spotted the quad bike keys hanging from a nail beside the back door. Such an ordinary thing, but it brought back memories of racing through those forests as a child while grandfather watched from the garden gate, pretending that he wasn't worried. I don't know what made me decide to take it out that evening. Maybe the quiet pressing in on me, or maybe trying to remember what it felt like before everything became complicated. The trail behind the stone barn was the same rutted track from childhood. The first stretch was cracked tarmac, with ferns creeping in from the sides. After a kilometre, it became patched earth, carved deep by decades of timber lorries. I passed an old hunting tower, just weathered planks nailed to an oak trunk. The ladder was snapped halfway up, the brake looking less like rot and more like something heavy has put its weight on the rungs. 15 minutes deeper, the track dropped into a wide clearing ringed by Scots pine. 3 rusted caravans sat in a crooked half circle, their windows smashed, doors hanging open like broken mouths. The clearing felt wrong somehow, the sort of place where nothing good had ever happened. Fresh tire tracks pressed into the soft ground made me cut the engine. The silence that followed wasn't natural. No birds or insects, just a hollow stillness that raised the hair on my neck. I walked to the nearest caravan and peered inside. The floor was carpeted with old leaves and torn fabric. In the far corner sat a pile of bones, small ones, maybe foxes or hares, arranged in careful rows like someone had taken the time to sort them properly. Backing away, I noticed the twine strung across the doorway. Small grey shapes dangled from it, clanking gently in the breeze that I couldn't feel. They were skulls, tiny ones, drilled through and threaded like rosary beads. My throat closed. I should have left then, climbed back on the quad, and gotten out. But some stubborn part of me needed to know where those tracks led. I followed the trail past the caravans. It narrowed into switchbacks, descending through the trees. Every few meters, there were boards nailed to trunks, painted with symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals wrapped around stick figures, circles slashed with diagonal lines. Some looked painted with something that had dried brown and flecked in the wind. The trail levelled into a hollow so deep it was almost dark. A collapsed stone foundation hunched into the hillside. In the centre was a doorway, a black opening, just wide enough to walk through. I edged closer. The smell hit me first, thick, sweet rot that clung to the back of my throat. 6 feet from the entrance, something shifted inside. A pile of grain sacks moved with slow, deliberate motion, like something underneath was trying to turn over. A scraping breath echoed from the darkness, low and wet. My knees went loose. I took a step back, then another, but before I could take a third, a hand clumped my shoulder. I froze, every thought emptying from my head. When I turned, a man stood beside me. He wore a battered tweed cap, pulled low, his beard streaked grey, his mouth twisted into a polite smile that held no warmth. "Don't go in there," he said, like he was giving directions to the post office. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He raised one finger to his lips. "You don't belong here. Turn around." Still I stood frozen. He leaned closer, his breath smelling disgusting. "Run!" He released my shoulder, and whatever held me snapped. I spun and bolted up the trail, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fell twice. I didn't look back. Some instinct warned me that I'd see something I could never forget. I reached the clearing as dust settled over the caravans. They loomed like broken teeth against the darkening sky. I climbed onto the quad with hands that wouldn't steady, fumbled the keys, and gunned it up the hill. I didn't slow until the barn roof appeared through the trees. That night, I loaded my car and left at first light. I was 24 when I agreed to help my cousin clear out a great aunt's cottage in the Sligo Mountains. I'd grown up not too far from there, but this place was hidden so deep in the hills that my mobile lost signal several kilometres before we reached the turn-off. The barring looked more like a sheep track than a road, just 2 ruts in the grass, choked with gorse and loose stones. You'd never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. Orla, my cousin, had been putting this off for weeks. Her great aunt had died alone in the kitchen. No one realised until the postman noticed letters spilling from the box and growing in piles. The guards found her 3 days later, still in her chair by the range. Orla kept saying she couldn't face going in there alone, her voice tight over the phone, like she was afraid I'd think she was being dramatic. But I understood why she didn't want to go in there by herself. The cottage was worse than I'd expected. When we finally reached it, the thatch had collapsed on one side, and ivy covered the whitewashed walls so completely you could barely see the windows. Half of the garden gate hung from one hinge. We sat in our cars for a long moment, engines ticking as they could. It was mid-afternoon, but the hulls pressed so close that the clearing felt dim, despite the overcast sky. You brought a torch? Orla asked, staring at the cottage. Of course, I said, checking my jacket pocket, even though I knew it was there. Just holding it steadied my nerves. She took a shaky breath. Let's get it done then. The front door drifted open at a touch, like it had been waiting on us. The smell nearly made me gag. Damp, stone cold ashes, and something sweet and rotten underneath. Dust coated everything. There was an old city by the dead fire, and a deal table covered in yellow newspapers. Orla pulled her jumper over her nose. Christ, it's worse than I thought. We'll just get through it quickly, I said. We split up without discussing it. She started in the sitting room, while I went through to the kitchen. The flags were cracked, and there by the range was a dark stain where they found her. I didn't look at it any longer than necessary. The presses held tins so old the labels had faded, and the glass jars full of what might have once been preserves. Most had collapsed into a grey mush that made my stomach turn. One jar held a pale lump of what almost looked like a sleeping animal. I backed out and closed the press door. After a couple hours working in silence, the light began to fade. We need to check the cellar before dark, I told Orla. She froze, her hand buried in a box of papers. She never let me down there. She used to say it wasn't safe for children. Safe how? I asked. Orla just shrugged, but her shoulders hunched near her ears, like she was bracing for a punch. I found the cellar door off the back kitchen. The hinges groaned as it swung open. Cold air flowed up around my ankles, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else. Something that reminded me of wet fur. The stairs were steep wooden planks. My torch beam wavered as I descended into the packed air floor. In the centre sat a heavy wooden table, its surface carved with dozens of shallow cuts. Iron hooks hung empty above it, swaying slightly as if someone had just brushed past. Along the far wall, shelves held more jars. The liquid inside looked yellowish, and the shapes floating in it didn't resemble anything I recognised. I was moving closer when I heard footsteps overhead. Orla? But there was no answer. My heart tried to crawl up my throat. I climbed the stairs quickly. When I reached the top, the door swung shut. The latch clicked with a sound that made my chest go cold. Orla! I hammered on the door with my palm. Open up! Her voice came through muffled. There's someone outside. What do you mean, someone? He's standing in the trees, watching the cottage. I pressed my forehead against the wooden door. Just open it. He's looking right at me. Then I heard footsteps move away. Orla! But I got no answer. Behind me, something shifted in the darkness. I turned, and my torch caught movement. A shape unfolding itself from behind stacked turf sods, thin limbs that seemed too long, joints bending in ways that weren't right. I backed against the stairs. My breathing became sharp. It raised what might have been a head, smooth skin stretched over tight bone, no features that I could make out in the torch beam. It began to crawl towards me, each movement making a soft, sucking sound against the earth floor. I threw myself against the door. Wood splintered. I had it again. On the third attempt, it flew open, and I stumbled into the kitchen. Orla was stood in the kitchen by the window, staring past me with wide eyes. "Where is he?" I gasped. "Gone back into the trees," Orla answered. I didn't wait. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her out towards the cars. We didn't speak until we reached the main road, and even then, we only agreed we'd never mention what happened to anyone else. I was 32 when I finally decided to spend a week alone in the most remote part of the Wicklow Mountains that I could reach without a guide. I'd been hiking for years, plenty of weekend trips, a few longer treks, but something about going completely off-grid kept nagging at me, like it was the only way I'd prove to myself I could handle true solitude. I spent a month planning, spreading ordnance survey maps across my kitchen table each evening after work. I traced old drovers' roads and sheep tracks, looking for places with no marked trails, nothing but contour lines and the occasional stream. I even found an old pamphlet from the National Park Service, faded cover, showing a black and white photo of a stone circle ruins and a heading that read "Lost Valleys of Wicklow." The pages were water stained, but there was enough detail to spark my curiosity. I ordered new gear, restocked my first aid kit, packed extra batteries, and a small wind-up radio, mostly for peace of mind, though I'd never used one. I even bought 3 different kinds of knives, which sounds excessive now, but it felt like proper caution then. Before leaving, I rang my brother Declan. I tried to sound casual, though I could tell he was skeptical. 6 days minimum, I told him, maybe 7. Don't worry if I don't check in right away. He sighed. You're basically volunteering to be on the crime channel. You know what? I laughed it off, though part of me wondered if he had a point. The morning I left, I got up before dawn. My old Volkswagen sagged under the weight of the gear, crammed into every space available. The trailhead I'd marked was just a gap in a stone wall where the R road peters out. No signs or markers, just an opening in the gorse that looked like a sheep track. I almost turned back, but I'd spent too much time preparing to quit over poor signage. That first day was everything I'd hoped for. The silence felt like a relief after city noise. I covered maybe 15 kilometers, passing only a ruined sheepfold and some collapsed lazy beds from famine times. Twice I had to climb over fallen trees that had claimed the path so completely that they seemed to be erasing it. Late afternoon, I reached the ridge I'd marked on my map as good flat ground. 100 meters west, the slope dropped into a quarry where a small stream ran over granite slabs. I pitched my tent in a natural bowl between 3 boulders. The spot felt hidden in a way that made my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. My dinner was rehydrated lamb stew. It tasted like warm salt water with mysterious chewy bits. Still, It was falling enough that I felt drowsy. By dark, I made notes in my journal about the route and which deer paths might be worth following. When I crawled under the tent, I rested my hand on my knife handle. Not from fear, I told myself, just habit from solo trips. The second morning, I woke to a thin mist curling across the quarry floor. So pale, it made everything look ghostly. Coffee tasted like burned plastic, but the caffeine helped. I walked the slow circuit of the campsite just to get orientated. The route sloped into a narrow glen. It seemed to invite exploration. So after lunch, I decided to follow it properly. The deeper I went, the more certain I became that no one had walked here in decades. Fallen trees lay across the glen like barriers. Once I found a length of rusted chain, half buried in leaf mould. Further on, a small pile of bones lay picked clean beside the stream, too small for sheep, but probably a fox or a hare. The glen was absolutely silent, not even a wind in the heather. On the way back, something caught my eye. A patch of fresh looking earth just off the main track, turned up in an uneven mound, too wide and shallow for any burrow that I could think of. A crawling unease prickled my neck, but I told myself it was just imagination. That evening, I stayed up later than usual, feeding the fire, stick after stick, and watching the edges of the quarry for movement. When the last logs crumbled to embers, I finally decided it was time to sleep. I don't know what time I woke. The moon was bright enough to throw shadows through the nylon. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then I heard it, a voice, low and close, speaking my name. Not shouting, not questioning, just spoken, steady and clear, like whoever it was knew exactly where I lay sleeping. My throat closed. I tried to swallow, but nothing moved. My ears rang so loud, I thought they'd drown out everything else. The voice didn't come again. Eventually I convinced myself it was just a dream. I lay wide-eyed until dawn crept through the mountains. When light finally came, I unzipped the tent, expecting to see tracks or some sign that I wasn't alone. Nothing was disturbed, the same quarry that I'd camped in. I spent the day trying to distract myself, collecting firewood, fishing the stream, organising gear. But as the light faded again, I felt pressure building in my chest, like the mountains themselves were leaning closer. That evening, I built a fire larger than before, dragging every dry branch I could find into a pile. I settled against one of the boulders, with my knees drawn up, thinking if I stayed awake, I'd feel more in control. But at some point, I must have dozed off. I awoke to embers fading and the cold seeping through my jacket. For a few seconds, I thought the night might pass without incident. Then, behind the boulder, I heard breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. Like whoever it was didn't care if I heard it, as long as I didn't turn around. My hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my torch. I sat paralysed, staring at the fire's last glow. The breathing never changed pace, never stopped, just continued until grey light touched the eastern peaks. When it finally ceased, I felt hollowed out. I broke camp on unsteady legs, shuffling everything into my pack without caring about the organisation. I just needed to move. I hiked hard, barely stopping for water, every backward glance expecting to see someone stepping onto view. The glen felt narrower, like the slopes were closing in. About a kilometre from the trailhead, I stopped so suddenly, my boots slipped on white stone. In the centre of the sheep track was a single, large bootprint, larger than mine by at least 2 sizes, pressed deep into the soft peat. No other tracks led to it or away from it. I didn't photograph it, didn't examine it closely, just started running. When I reached my car, I got in and locked the doors. And that was the last time I ever hiked alone. I spent that summer working for a small heritage survey outfit in County Clare. Nothing glamorous, mostly me, a clipboard, and long days sweating through my shirt while documenting whether a patch of archaeological remains was the same as one recorded 20 years earlier. Our team was small, just 6 of us, taking turns, updating old surveys and driving to places so remote you wonder why anyone bothered keeping them on official maps. The old timers called these sites forgotten ground, which always sounded dramatic to me. But after what happened, I think forgotten was being generous. I remember the morning they assigned me to Site 47, first Monday in June, working from a converted heritage office with a tin roof that pinged like a snare drum when the sun hit it. My supervisor handed me the file. Half of the papers were photocopies of photocopies, blurry and barely legible. The last field report was from 1979. Some archaeologist named O'Sullivan had typed it up on what it must have been a manual typewriter. Mostly just lists, stone circles, raft foundations, rough counts of possible medieval structures. But tacked on at the end was a single line. Anomalous settlement remains. Recommend extreme caution. That was it. No explanation or follow-up. I figured he'd been spooked by a badger set, or maybe some unstable ground. I signed out a GPS unit, one of those grey bricks that lose a signal if you look at it wrong. Grabbed fresh survey sheets and loaded up my gear. The drive out took almost 2 hours. The road devolved from tarmac to those chippings to what was basically a cart track through the burn. There were stretches where the grass between the tyre ruts was taller than my wing mirrors. Eventually, the track gave up entirely. I pulled over where it dissolved into limestone pavement. When I got out, everything went quiet in a way I didn't like. I turned slowly, looking for landmarks, and finally spotted a line of concrete posts that looked more like grave markings than anything built for utility. About 3 meters up the hawthorn trunk, someone had nailed a weathered board with 47 burned into the wood. That was my only confirmation that I was in the right place. I shouldered my pack, clipped the compass to my strap, and stepped over the collapsed stone wall. Within 20 paces, the road had completely disappeared behind me. The landscape here was pure burn, Limestone pavements cracked into geometric patterns, with hazel and ash growing up from the fissures, like the earth was trying to stitch itself back together. The first hour felt routine enough. I stopped every few minutes to note patches of hurt-stung fern and the occasional orchid. The GPS flickered in and out, but I trusted the compass way more anyway. I was working my way along a low ridge when I noticed a gap in the limestone. Not a natural fissure, but something deliberately cleared. I shifted for a better look, saw the edge of a work stone tucked into the hollow. It looked so out of place. I thought I was imagining it at first. I knew I should have marked the coordinates and kept moving, but something about the site felt like it was waiting specifically for me. So I climbed down, picking my steps carefully between the loose stones. The foundation was rectangular, built from limestone blocks, fitted without mortar, and inside was a cast iron pot, its surface eaten through by rust, and what looked like the remains of a stone quern for grinding grain. I crouched and started clearing leaves with my boot. Every small thing I uncovered felt like another piece of a story that didn't quite fit. Glass fragments that might have been bottles once. A metal spoon with the handle almost bent in half. A child's shoe, the leather so cracked it crumbled when I touched it. That's when I heard the sound. Deliberate movement, like something heavy shifting its weight from foot to foot. I froze. My first thought was it was cattle, although I hadn't seen any grazing nearby. I stood slowly, scanning the limestone pavements. There was nothing visible, just scattered hawthorns and the occasional juniper bush, but my skin felt prickly, like it does when you wake from a dream you can't quite remember. I called out, trying to sound casual. Heritage survey down here. Just documenting the site. No response came. I took a few steps upslope, looking for tracks, and that's when I heard the second sound. A branch snapping, followed by a soft thud, like something dropping to the ground. I moved towards a lone ash tree, hoping to see nothing at all behind it. But what I found was a clear bootprint in the soft earth between the limestone slabs. The heel was pressed deep, like whoever made it had pushed off suddenly. Something flipped inside me then, not quite panic, but close. My hands went clammy, and my breathing turned shallow. I needed to get back to the car. The walk back felt wrong from the start. The limestone formations seemed closer together, the gaps between them narrower. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following, just out of sight. About halfway to where I parked, the GPS went completely dark. I clutched it anyway, just needing something solid to hold. The silence was absolute. No insects, no birds, just a whisper of wind across the stone. Then I heard the voice. Come back to us. Quiet but clear, like someone speaking through old radio static. I stopped dead, ears straining. Nothing. Then it came again, closer. Come back. My hands went slick with sweat. I took a step backward, then another, trying to convince myself but it was wind through the hawthorns. The third time it spoke, something inside me gave up pretending. I ran. I didn't care about the noise. Didn't even care about my footing. My pack slammed against my spine with every step. Branches caught my jacket and scratched my arms, but I couldn't make myself slow down. When I finally stumbled to a halt, I was shaking so badly I had to grab a tree trunk to stay upright. I bent over, gasping in short bursts, and looked around, hoping that something would look familiar. But nothing did. I forced myself to think. If I kept going downhill, I'd hit the track eventually. That was the only plan I could manage. I started walking again, quieter this time, in an attempt not to broadcast my location. The limestone seemed to press closer with every step. After what felt like an hour, I saw light ahead. Just a pale strip between the trees. I didn't trust it at first, convinced it would vanish if I moved too quickly. But I picked up my pace anyway, then broke into a run when I was sure it was real. I burst from the trees and nearly fell to my knees with relief. My car sat exactly where I left it, weeds brushing the bumper. I forced myself to turn around and look one last time. At first, there was nothing, just shadows and limestone. Then something stepped into view at the tree line. A tall figure in a dark coat, arms hanging too long at its sides. I couldn't make out a face, but it raised one hand in what might well have been a wave. I didn't wait to see more. I climbed into the car with shaking hands, dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. When the engine started, I reversed so fast that the tires spun on the loose stone. I drove the 2 hours back to the Heritage office in complete silence. Not even the radio or my own thoughts, really. When I got there, I filled my report without mentioning what I'd seen. I just added the GPS coordinates and a note about further investigation required. I never went back to Site 47, and I made sure no one else got assigned there either.